Okay, that's better. I think that's better now. My name is Peter Neal. I'm president of the South Street Seaport Museum. My job is to welcome you to not only to the South Street Seaport Museum, to one of a number of events that we've been produced in conjunction with New York is Book Country. Just to explain what is happening here, we're not always quite so glamorous at South Street. It's a new experience for us, but this is Book Television, I think it's called, Book Television, which is part of C-SPAN. So you're part of a kind of a celebrity group this evening. Mike Wallace has been involved with this museum for a long, long time, not as long as he's been involved with the project that he's going to talk about tonight. And I'm sure he's sensitive about that. But the fact is that Mike, who is a professor of history at John Jay College at City University, has tried to do what is almost impossible, and that is, with his colleague, to try to wrap his brain around the incomprehensible, wonderful, myriad, storied tale of New York. And to be able to do that in a responsible way, in a comprehensive way, is a daunting task. We're trying to do it with material culture here at the museum, and Mike has been an advisor to our forthcoming permanent exhibit on the history of the Port of New York. And that's just a piece of what he's tried to do. And so we have to give him tremendously high marks for courage, intellectual boldness, and I've read some of it, and if you haven't had a chance, it's in this little brochure, and some of you may have had a chance to get one of these. I don't know if we have any here, but get them, because I've read this, and what is even more remarkable is its readable history. It is absolutely cream to read. It just flows in the most interesting and kind of conversational way, never relinquishing its responsibility, but at the same time drawing you into the narrative qualities of course, what makes history so exciting to us all. So without further ado, Professor Mike Wallace, who will talk to us about Gotham, A History of New York City to 1898.
Thanks so much, Peter. Peter's certainly right about the scope of this enterprise. I'm not so sure that courage and boldness are opposite, rather than perhaps megalomania. Ted and I have been working on this project for, depending on how you slice it, somewhere around 15 to 20 years. The book that's coming out in November, Gotham, really goes up to 1898, the consolidation year for the city, and then I'll trundle on myself for the second volume, which will come out a couple of years down the road, I hope. Peter's also right in that we really tried to do two things here, and the cover, what I'll do is I've just got a few of these little pamphlets that Oxford University Press has put out in advance of the book's actual publication, which will be out November 1st. And I'll pass these around for you. I'll also, why not, I'll pass around in typescript still, because the book isn't back from the printer, an annotated table of contents, so you can get a sense of how truly insane the range of topics is. But what's nice about the cover, one of the reasons that I liked it, is it's an aerial view from the 1850s of New York City with South Street, where we are now, hovering just over here, of course. And what I like about it is that it's a broad synoptic view of the whole island from this grand overarching perspective, and yet it's very precise in its attention to details and specifics, so you can pick out City Hall and so forth. And that's what we've tried to do, and that's what I'm going to try to do tonight. I'm going to try to do both things. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about some of the broad conceptual apparatus and apply it to one particular point in the city's history, and then I'll read just a few pages from the manuscript so that you'll get a sense of how it plays out in detail on the ground. So let me just, I'll pass these things around, and whenever they wander back, that'd be great. Okay. the first question that usually anybody asks is when you say that you're attempting to take on the entire history of New York City is, so New, what's your shtick? How can you get a handle on something of this magnitude? And in fact, there isn't one particular shtick. There's a variety of them. There's a variety of tracks that run through this manuscript, which is a narrative organized chronologically from the Ice Age, actually, until eventually the day after tomorrow. But things do run through it. At the largest, highest level of analysis, we're interested in tracking the city's changing position on the planet, from being essentially Indian territory to being a kind of a pissant backwater of this colossal Dutch Empire, to being a more important trading port in the English Empire, to being, for a short space of time, the capital of the United States, to being the critical interlink between Europe and agricultural North America, to being the headquarters city of an expanding national corporate economy, to being the headquarters city of a global multinational economy, and the center of the world, arguably. So one of the trajectories is looking at the city's motion from the edge to the center of the world, which of course raises the question of what next, but that's happily not to be worried about in this talk. What I want to do today is to just focus on one of those critical segments and at a transition moment. One I picked because, in fact, during these years in particular, South Street is the center of the action, the most critical place really in the city. And I'm going to sandwich my talk between two fires. The first one just alluded to fleetingly. The second one, the Great Fire of 1835, I'll read you a little bit about from the manuscript. So let's start with the moment, actually a little after the Great Fire of the Revolutionary period, which burned down a vast majority of the town and left much of it in smoking ruins by the time the British left. Let's start with that moment when actually the British are sailing away, the revolution is over, and in fact the ships are just heading out to sea, and an attempt is made to run the new American flag up the flagpole in Fort George down near where the Battery Park now is. And they have trouble because they can't get the English flag down because clever devils, the English, have nailed it to the mast on their way out. So an enterprising, vigorous young fellow named Van Arsdale gets little hobnail boots and throws some nails up and clambers up to the top and rips off the Union Jack and raises the new Stars and Stripes just before the last ships kind of, sail out of view. So great moment. And of course, obviously, people are thrilled that this is now an independent republic. But from the perspective of New Yorkers, the possibility is disaster. Independence, liberation might in fact mean tremendous trouble for the Port of New York. Why? Because most of the sources of strength and wealth, most of the ways in which the city earned its living over the previous 150 years are more or less kaput. You must understand that the city's role in the English Empire was basically a supply depot for the really critical part of the English Empire, which was the West Indies, Jamaica, and islands that were producing sugar, white gold. It was the most a tremendous source of income for the British Empire. And what we did, basically, was to the farmers in the surrounding area, and the surrounding area meant Queens and Brooklyn and Upper Hudson Valley, were to grow wheat and to raise cattle, which were then packed on board ships here, sent down to the West Indies, and then bringing back from the West Indies sugar, which in fact was processed here. It was that connection which was really the heartbeat of the city, trade within the realm of the British Empire. War, which was a commonplace in the 18th century, was another standby. The city did extremely well during wartime, when the English and the French, in essence, clashed for control of North America and the Caribbean. The spin-offs for the city were enormous. When the British fleet was in town, to launch an invasion, say, of Canada up the Hudson River, 20,000, 30,000 people would show up on the doorstep of this rather small little village, and they would need everything. They would need ship repair, they would need entertainment, you know, so the tavern keepers were happy, the merchants were happy, the farmers were happy, the whores were happy. You know, it was a town that thrived on those kind of benefits. The city, it must also be said, thrived on slavery. And the city was deeply involved in the slave trade, really, of course, in the earliest days, the Dutch days as well. The city also in the English period thrived on piracy in earlier parts of its history. This was a fence city, really. Pirates, when they would capture their prizes, they would bring them to New York City to sell. And once again, the pirates would come to town, and the city would be overjoyed because money would be flowing into all the local channels of commerce. Independence is a potential nightmare because almost all of these operations are either phased out immediately or the future for them is looking extremely grim. The British say, okay, you want an independence, well, you got it. This means you're outside the empire. It means you can forget trading with Jamaica and the British West Indies. So the lifeline is cut. It's a disaster for Jamaica as well, but you know, the British will stand for it. Slavery is on the way out, and the slave trade is in fairly short order not a viable means of making income. There are some rogues who continue to do it, but it's not a serious proposition. Piracy is kaput. There are going to be no more British fleets coming into the city. So it is, in fact, looking for a time grim. It's probably worsened a little bit by the fact that the city was at least looking forward to being the capital of the United States. And Washington, of course, is inaugurated just up the street from here. But in fact, in that infamous deal that Alexander Hamilton cuts with Thomas Jefferson, they sell the city down the river, Potomac River in this case, in exchange for support from Southern congressmen for New York City's development of a banking center. So, where does this leave the city? Well, needless to say, it does not go into an economic tailspin. It does not go belly up. It does not become a premature rust belt. In fact, it begins now in the first 20, 30 years of the 19th century on a spectacular ascent, which is by the 1830s, the 1840s, I would argue, has put it in the front rank of American cities, and it's never going to look back for the next 100 and some odd years. So then the question becomes, how'd they pull this off? And in an odd way, the bottom line answer is, it's the Brits, thank goodness. Although the British were, in fact, enraged at the ex-colonies and particularly unhappy with New York City, nonetheless, by virtue of their own development, things happened which the city was able to take advantage of, which in fact led to this takeoff. What were they? Obviously, the frontispiece is the Industrial Revolution, the development of cotton manufacturing in England from the 1790s on at least. What does this mean? It means that, in fact, England needs things. It needs food for its workforce, which is increasingly trooping off the countryside and into places like Manchester, and it needs cotton for its new cotton mills. I'm abbreviating, there's lots of other things, but those are sort of central. Where are they going to get them from? Well, they're going to get them from North America. Even though they're no longer in the empire, the logic of trading connections means that North America is going to supply the kinds of things that, in fact, the English need because it's in their profitable interest. In particular, where are they going to get food? Well, they're going to get it from what we then would have called the Northwest, Ohio and such. And the pioneers, as we know, go racing across shortly after the army has wiped out the local Indians to claim these rich agricultural lands and to begin to grow fabulous crops in this incredibly fertile territory. Then in the South, slavery, which had actually been kind of slightly problematic and in trouble because tobacco, which was what it had been linked to, is on the way out, gets a new lease on life. When cotton prices go up on the Liverpool Exchange, A lot of Southerners say, hey, here's a new potentially fabulous cash crop. All we need is land and slaves. They get the land courtesy of, a variety of generals, Andrew Jackson being an important one, by, in fact, wiping out the Indian resistance. And they purchase large numbers of slaves, and slavery expands into the West. So the question is, what does this have to do with New York City? Well, unfortunately, it looks for a time as if it's not going to have much to do with New York City at all. If you're going to get crops, either wheat and corn and such, or cotton, to industrializing England, and more generally to Europe, because they keep having wars in the Napoleonic era, which increased tremendously the demand for food and such. If you're going to get food there, if you're going to get cotton there, and you're talking sailing ships, of course, the easiest way for them to travel is down the ready-to-wear river system of North America, which means the Mississippi and the various rivers that drain the Midwest and drain the South down to, alas, not New York, but New Orleans. So, in a sense, New York City, which had been a crucial port in the English Empire, because in those days, proximity counted. It was close to England on the one hand, more than any other port, and it was close to the West Indies. But now that the action is moving out to Ohio and down to Alabama, where's New York going to be in all of this? Well, nowhere unless it acts. And what's fascinating is the degree to which New Yorkers, and here we're talking in this period critically, entrepreneurially inclined merchants on the one hand, backed by the power of the municipal and state governments. These are public or public-private enterprises. The idea being that New York is going to somehow or another insert itself between these three most dynamic areas of the 19th century, emerging 19th century economy. The industrial Midlands of England, the southern planter slave South, and the small farmer Midwest. How do they do this? Well, three classic dimensions to this. First and foremost, the most obvious is the Erie Canal. Taking advantage of topography, there's that break in the Appalachian Mountain chain, which generally made it, of course, impossible for farmers to get their goods to New York if they went over those mountains, especially when there were no roads. But by cutting a canal that basically allows you to move your goods into the Great Lakes and to the river systems, and then run them down to Buffalo, which was then a little nothing place, and then load them onto canal boats, and then down to the Hudson River and down to New York City, you've established a waterway, a direct route to these enterprising areas. So the Erie Canal, a public sponsored enterprise, DeWitt Clinton is the most famous name associated with it, is crucial. Starts in 1817, completed in 1824. Interestingly, there was a tremendous celebration in New York City. The whole city turned out for an extraordinary day in 24 when barges left from Buffalo went carrying some water from Lake Erie and came all the way down the Hudson, and they were brought in a grand aquatic ceremony and then poured ceremonially into the Atlantic, this kind of mingling and merging of the waters, with the whole city out applauding and cheering because they understood that this connection which had been struck was crucial to the future well-being of the city. It was one of the earliest of what we call in the book festivals of connection. And there are going to be many of them where the city celebrates its insertion to some larger network, some larger grid. Secondly, there was the problem that even after you had this water route connection, there was still the unfortunate problem that the waterways which gave you in the Midwest access to the Great Lakes, alas, ran south. So did the Mississippi. So for that matter did the Hudson River. Enter the steamboat. And to the degree that the steamboat, which is again a joint, in essence, public-private venture, Robert Livingston, who's got an estate up the Hudson River, who desperately wants to get his own goods down, but also back from New York City, finances Fulton. The steamboat is successfully invented, and not only does it allow Livingston to get his goods up to his estate. It allows boats to run up the Mississippi, up the Ohio. It allows the direction, the natural flow of commerce to reverse itself, to run also into canals that then these Midwestern states build to ease the process into the Great Lakes and on down to New York City. The third link in this is the expansion of what New York already had as an advantage over New Orleans, which was, it was a mercantile city. It had experience with trade. It had a whole raft of not just boats, but it had shipbuilders, it had sail makers, it had instrument makers, it had map makers. It was a city organized around commerce. And they take it to the next step. They take it to the next step with the invention, the development of something called the Black Ball Line, which invents, in essence, regularly scheduled shipping between New York and Liverpool and then on after that in Europe generally. What does this mean? In the old days, when somebody wanted to get goods on a ship, you never know when it was going to sail, because in fact boats sailed only when they had a full-size cargo. Also, they only sailed, in fact, when it was decent weather. Now, the first vessel that sails in January of 1817, actually I think it sailed from the Hudson River side, if I'm right, just as the clock on Trinity struck noon. It was a snowy day, and the boat, in fact, was only about less than a third full. But it's upped anchor with another crowd sort of watching, amazed at a ship heading out into the North Atlantic in the middle of winter. Why? Because they were determined to make a point. And they made it successfully, so successfully that other companies, it's sort of like, Federal Express, when Federal Express did well, then Purolator jumped in and so forth. And what you had was, again, the sense of the city as being a dependable link. So Liverpool cotton manufacturers who wanted their goods to arrive on time on a regular clockwork basis, planters who wanted to turn over their cotton profits very quickly, knew that this was a place that was speedy, quick, and assured in terms of a commercial link. I want to suggest that it is this establishment of a linkage between the North American continent and Europe, in which the city manages to put itself smack in the center, that is the most critical aspect of New York City's history, arguably at any point in time, but certainly in this era in the 19th century. And I want to say just a little bit about what follows from this, which is damn near everything. Because, in fact, it's not simply that you've got goods that are going to Europe. Those same boats are turning around and they're coming back. And they're coming back, and overwhelmingly they're coming here, because this is the place where you know that you can unload your things and get them onto the Erie Canal and off into the interior. What happens? Well, manufactured goods obviously come in, but it's not just that. Everything comes. Money comes. So people understand that this is the place, to send cash if you're interested in investing in this new burgeoning third world country. And New York, in fact, explodes as a financial center as a consequence. There had been virtually no banks at the time of the revolution. The Brits, in fact, didn't allow it. There had been no stock exchange. Again, the Brits didn't allow this. Now there's a tremendous expansion of this as an auxiliary to this mercantile trade. What else happens? Well, there is the insurance industry. You're in fact sending these ships off into the North Atlantic. Now, that may be nice, but of course the downside is that they may get caught in one of those squalls and never be seen again. So the marine insurance industry explodes and becomes a crucial aspect of the city. Manufacturing. To some extent, all it does is expand traditional manufacturing. The shipyards all along the East River here increase enormously in their dimension to turn out the ever new, ever larger. By the 1840s, 50s, we're talking the giant tall ships, the clipper ships. And this is a preeminent place of manufacturing. But it is also a place where you begin to get a more profound transformation. And it's not in ships, it's in shoes, or it's in shirts, or it's in tables. And in essence, local manufacturers who had been making shoes for whoever lived in the 3-block radius now begin to say to themselves, there's all these buyers, you know, coming into town from Ohio, from Alabama, because they're coming to the big auction houses to buy wholesale goods, bolts of cotton cloth when they come off the ships. But they're tremendous markets also. There's all those pioneers out there. They need shoes. There's all those slaves down there. They need shirts, you know. So they begin to start transforming their workshops, and in essence, the transformation of manufacturing into capitalist industry is something which is generated, galvanized by this tremendous flux and flow of goods coming in and out of the port. Those buyers coming into town from Ohio, where are they going to stay? Well, you know, there had been inns and such before, but now, boom, the hotel industry begins to, particularly along Broadway, just a few blocks from here, you begin to get ever larger hotels. The first restaurants, in fact, crop up at the same time. The theater, which had been an old tradition in Manhattan, now, in fact, goes to a whole new dimension of things because you've got a tremendous amount of both business folks coming into town and increasingly tourists coming into town. There's this sense that this place is the exciting center of things. This is the place to be, something to sort of visit, really on its own right. The sex trades, in fact, explode. You, of course, had prostitution before, but it had been a small-scale affair. Brothels here, basically, and basically for their clientele being basically sailors and transients. But now, in fact, the sex trades explode, and they're all over the city. Brothels, in fact, expand into sort of nice neighborhoods across the way. In fact, the city becomes, as it's going to be known for the rest of the supposedly Victorian century, the most wide-open, raunchiest place on the North American continent. What else comes in? Information comes in. We have this kind of odd notion that we're maybe just now moving into an information age, you know, and post-industrial economy. Well, you know, it's very, very hard to make those kind of divisions. In fact, the city is awash in the information revolution very early on. Why? News gets here first. And New York newspapers seize on this, and this place becomes the center of the journalism and the publishing industry already very early on. Again, partly for the same reasons. Books and newspapers are commodities. They, too, get on the barges. They go out on the Erie Canal. They're carried by steamboats down the coast and such. So New York, very quickly, which is cements. Again, we tend to forget this, but New York has been a tremendously fertile center of technological innovation. The steamboat's one, but in this period, the telegraph is another. I mean, the physics of this are worked out elsewhere, but Morse, who's a professor at the fledgling NYU, is in fact working out and polishing and making and bringing to practical reality the telegraph. That's immediately seized on by the news media. The Associated Press follows, and we command the linkage, again, between Europe, the flow of information, and the burgeoning North American hinterland. So what have you got? You've got a dynamo that really feeds on itself, and all of these parts are interrelated, and they all sort of gain strength and energy for themselves. And where I want to segue to now is, in fact, the consequences for this particular neck of the woods. The port is obvious. This is, in fact, the center where it's all happening. Actually, the port's slightly problematic because New York tends to build very quick and dirty and cheap docks, which, in fact, are smelly. We have by no means solved many of our social problems in this period. That's going to come a lot later on down the road. But in fact, we are dumping our effluent in the river. It washes up on those docks. This whole area reeks beyond belief. But it's got an advantage. Those docks are so cheap, and the city keeps the wharfage prices low. It means that, in fact, it's a lot cheaper, as well as more efficient and for a variety of other reasons, for, in fact, boats to come in here and do their merchanting business. But it also means that this area begins to change dramatically, starting a little before this, but from the 1790s and then on through this particular period. It had been the case that this was not only the port center, but this was in fact where everybody lived. The city wasn't in fact a whole lot bigger than this stretch of the lowest tip of the island. And what begins to happen as one of the consequences of this connection with the West Indies and elsewhere is that in fact this is also diseases are imported, and so yellow fever and cholera and such are problems in this neck of the woods. That in fact first the rich begin to leave. They go across the island, not very far by contemporary standards, to Lower Manhattan, to Lower Broadway around the Battery. And this place becomes ever more concentrated as a commercial center and a financial center, and yet it is still operating within the parameters of, in essence, a 18th century town. To some extent, a little farther down, 17th century cow paths. So that's the point at which we are by the 1830s. Banks and insurance companies are occupying old brownstones, old colonial era mansions. Warehouses are beginning, like your warehouses just over here on Schermerhorn, to sort of break the crust a bit and to thrust up. But in a sense, there's an odd kind of contradiction between the received built environment and these tremendous forces which are raging through the city. And in an odd way, what resolves that contradiction is the event that I'll just sort of finish off by reading you, so that both you get a finis to this story, but also you get a sense that this book is about more than these kind of astronomical satellites eye view kind of stuff. They're there, but we try to sort of have them carried through the narrative itself. So let's turn to the frigid evening of December 16th, 1835, when high winds are pummeling downtown Manhattan. The temperature kept plunging, and before the night was over, would bottom out at 17 degrees below zero. Just before 9 p.m., as Watchman Hayes passed the corner of Exchange and Pearl Streets, he smelled smoke and summoned other watchmen. They quickly discovered the source in a 5-story warehouse. Subsequent investigation would incontrovertibly establish that stove coals had ignited gas escaping from a broken line. Gas had arrived in about 1820s. Forcing open the door, they found the interior all aflame. They watched helplessly as the inferno blew through the roof and jumped across the narrow and crooked streets, whipped by the wind. Within 15 minutes, fully 50 of the area's tightly packed buildings were ablaze. The watchman spread the alarm. The new City Hall sentinel clanged his bell. The jail next door took up the pealing. Church belfries chimed in. The firemen, who now crawled out of their beds, exhausted from fighting 2 bad fires the night before, were members of a short-handed and demoralized department. The cholera epidemics had taken a heavy toll on their ranks, which in any event had not kept pace with the growth of population. The city had more than doubled in size since 1823, but the number of volunteers in 1835 stood at 1,500, up only 285 over the same period. Chief Engineer James Gulick, the 6'2" idol of the department, had cut down on slugfests between companies for control of hydrants, but feuds still festered. Some of the firemen's troubles were of their own making. The manly volunteers stubbornly insisted on dragging their hand-operated engines to the scene rather than permitting horses to be used, and had no tolerance whatever for the new steam fire engines that London had deployed since 1829. Even had they been in peak condition, the firemen faced an impossible task. By midnight, the freezing winds had lashed the fire to an awesome and unmanageable ferocity. Many thought the last days of Pompeii the only fitting comparison. The sky was lit so brightly that the glow could be seen in Poughkeepsie, in New Haven, and Philadelphia, where firemen turned out thinking their suburbs were aflame. Help came from near and far. Brooklyn sent company after company by ferry. A locomotive was rushed from Jersey City to Newark and returned with a train of flat cars loaded with fire engines. One company came all the way from Philly. As the flames roared down to Water Street, jumping like flashes of lightning, Philip Hone recalled later, arriving volunteers discovered that all the wells, cisterns, and hydrants were frozen solid. Gulick sent a dozen engines to the East River. It was frozen too. Hook and ladder men took their axes, ran to the ends of the piers, chopped holes in the ice, dragged an engine over, rigged up a series of machines along Coenties Slip and up Water Street, only to discover that water froze in the hose. By jumping up and down on the lines to break the ice clots and pouring alcohol into the engine pumps, they worked up some feeble streams, only to have the wind hammer the water back in their faces. Some, reduced to the apathy of despair, stood about helplessly, pouring brandy in their boots to keep their feet from freezing. Others turned to salvage operations, dragging tons of silks, satins, laces, and shawls out of warehouses. One phalanx piled a 30-foot-high mountain of goods in the center of Hanover Square, only to watch it vanish in flames that vaulted out from the warehouse of Peter Remsen and Company. Later, there were also bitter complaints about the predatory behavior of cartmen, who charged exorbitant rates for moving possessions away from the flames and refused to serve any but the wealthy. The fire headed north, seizing the marble and supposedly fireproof Merchants Exchange. It's on Wall Street. Heroic rescuers saved the trading records, charting the speculative movements underway at the new Stock and Exchange Board, but efforts to salvage the statue of Alexander Hamilton failed, and the would-be recovery men just escaped being buried in the collapse of the great 60-foot cupola. Around 4 a.m., the Tontine Coffee House went up. Foreman Mills of Eagle Engine number 13 realized that if the flames crossed Wall Street, the upper half of the city would go. 2 buildings were blown up to block the fire's passage by depriving it of fuel. The gambit worked, and with Mayor Lawrence's permission, was deployed more vigorously. Lawrence dispatched Charles King, editor of the New York American, to the Navy Yard for officers and sailors to do the demolitions, and for gunpowder with which to do them. Their supplies proved inadequate. When Mayor Lawrence and Colonel Hamilton raced from grocery to grocery, scraping together portions of powder, and others ransacked the arsenal, tearing open cartridges, King and a boatload of Marines fought their way through the ice-obstructed river to the Red Hook Point Powder House and ferried back enough 25-pound kegs to prevent the inferno from crossing Coenties Slip. By morning, the fire, though balked, raged uncontrollably. Its domain from Maiden Lane to Coenties Slip, from William Street to the East River, was a 13-acre ocean of burning waves. As if alive and determined to break out, it forayed out onto the river, where boats had been hastily removed. Gallons of blazing turpentine cascaded down the shore and rolled across the ice, setting a few vessels on fire. The conflagration took another night and day to burn itself out. Even then, thick black clouds spewed into the winter sky. It would not be completely quenched for 2 weeks. Troops were brought in the first night to control looting. Sentinels stood guard for days amid ruins littered with charred merchandise, scorched silks, laces, prints, and a mountain of coffee on the corner of Old Slip and South Street. The night of the fire, over 90 people were seized in the act of carrying away property. The next day, 200 more were arrested. Hone ranted to his diary about, quote, the miserable wretches who prowled about the ruins and became beastly drunk on the champagne and other wines and liquors with which the streets and wharves were lined. Worse, he said, they seemed to exult in the misfortune, and such expressions were heard as, they'll make no more 5% dividends. One of the more unlikely things I can imagine a crowd saying. The mayor doubled the watch and accepted the aid of 1,000 volunteers. In the aftermath, voracious demands for information spurred the new penny press to innovative heights. The Sun published a morning edition of 23,000 and an extra of 30,000 for a record-shattering one-day circulation of 53,000. The Herald, in its December 21st issue, used illustrations for the first time. One 2-column woodcut showed the remains of the Merchants Exchange. Another mapped the area of destruction. Nathaniel Currier, a 22-year-old lithographer from Massachusetts who had set up shop on Nassau Street the previous year, leapt to prominence with his Prince of the Fire, one of which inspired a scene in Harrington's new grand moving diorama, which opened at the American Museum in 1836. In succeeding days, the press and others counted the costs. 674 buildings had burned, 80 on Front Street alone. Almost every structure south of Wall and east of Broad was to some degree a casualty. Estimates of losses in buildings and merchandise ranged from $18 to $26 million, more than 3 times the cost of the Erie Canal. 23 of the city's 26 fire insurance companies went bankrupt. Unable to get coverage, merchant Luman Reed had cleverly loaded his most valuable goods on a schooner, dropped anchor in the harbor, and took out marine insurance. 4,000 clerks were temporarily thrown out of work, along with thousands of cartmen and porters. The most telling statistics, however, were these. Only 2 people died in the fire, a function of the commercial district's almost complete lack of residential housing. And within a year, 500 new buildings had been built, the area entirely restored, indeed dramatically improved, testimony to the underlying strength of the mercantile economy and the tremendous momentum of the boom that was then underway. Post-fire reconstruction started almost instantly, with Arthur Tappan, a leading merchant, first off the mark. At dawn the day after, he told his clerks, "We must rebuild immediately." One went to fetch an architect. The rest fitted up temporary quarters. And at noon, the Journal of Commerce carried a notice announcing the store was open for business as usual by the blessings of God. And by mid-afternoon, workmen began clearing the still warm rubble. In short order, the new style, high-rise Greek Revival granite warehouses were going up everywhere, with iron shutters and independent foot-thick brick walls as fire protection. Even buildings still standing were transformed as masons knocked out the old brick and brownstone ground floors and hoisted stylish granite piers into place. Block after block took on a dignified new look. The Delmonicos, whose establishment had been wiped out, bought a triangular plot at the junction of Beaver, William, and South William, formerly Mill Streets. Work started in August 1836 on a 3.5-story brick and brownstone structure with marble trim. In a nicely defiant touch, the marble porch pillars were brought from Pompeii. By December, the carpets and gas fixtures were being fitted into the luxurious first and second story saloons of an appearance far surpassing anything of the kind in the city, and the third floor had facilities for private dining, evoking Parisian splendor, as did the immense wine vaults for 16,000 bottles. Grandest of all was the new Merchants Exchange. Within a week of the fire, the Merchants Exchange Company solicited plans, chose an aggressive Greek revival plan by Isaiah Rogers with a 12-columned Corinthian coronade. $1 million in subscriptions was raised by February 1836. By April, construction was underway on the site of its predecessor, expanded to cover an entire block. Built of Massachusetts granite, this is the building which, of course, is still there underneath the second story that was added in the 20th century. I'm not even sure what it is now. It's gone through so many incarnations. Built of Massachusetts granite, it featured an enormous central hall surmounted by a vast saucer dome, 80 feet in diameter. It's still there. If you go inside, you can see it, but it's no longer visible from the outside. When it opened for business 5 years later, it would include offices for insurance companies, bankers, brokers, the Chamber of Commerce, and later the New York Stock and Exchange Board, as well as a reading room stocked with papers from every state in the Union and countries overseas, together with a foreign letter office. It was frequently compared to the Paris Bourse. All along Wall Street, banks and insurance companies began demolishing their former residences, those red brick facades, fanlight doorways, and dormer windows that now seemed so old-fashioned, and erecting stone front portico Doric temples. Within a few years, the street boasted perhaps the greatest concentration of classical columns built since the fall of Rome. This transformation would take a few years to complete, but by the anniversary of the catastrophe, Hone observed, quote, "Fine and commodious stores, much improved in their appearance and construction, nearly covered the burnt district." Quote, "To the honor of the merchants," he exulted, "and as an evidence of the prosperity of the city, the whole is rebuilt with more splendor than before." Well, that's, I think, is as good a point as any to stop our slice of this enterprise. And perhaps if people would have some questions and such, be glad to take a crack at answering them.
Do you touch on immigration when different vast
I
countries?
should say, excuse me, I've been asked by the book TV people that if in fact you don't mind being immortalized, although I guess videotape can always be erased, if you could stand up and speak into the mic. But if you don't want to, then forget it. That's their problem. What's your question, Denny?
When were the vast amounts of immigration from what countries brought here so that all this population grew? And so you had workers for this work.
This place has been a magnet for immigrants since certainly the 18th century. Things, in fact, were perking. What's fascinating is that the real transformation in terms of scale of things comes just at this moment. It's, in fact, beginning to seriously pick up steam through the 1830s, really even in the 20s, somewhat. Of course, the huge influx, the thing that's going to absolutely transform this manufacturing transformation that I started talking about in this period, what's going to take it the whole next way into the universe of sweatshops is going to be the arrival of the Irish and the Germans, and that's largely the 1840s and the 1850s. But it is, in fact, in progress already, attracted by this beacon of energy and wealth and job opportunities in the 1830s in a serious way. But it's still largely from England, remarkably. We forget about that, you know, but it's still traditional sources of flow. So there's English and there's Welsh and there's Scots and such very heavily dominating the migration until the Irish take off. Yes, sir.
How long is this work? Because if I get some impression of how detailed it is, it must be intensely.
I was hoping nobody would ask this.
Intensely.
Terribly embarrassing question. Yes, no, we have committed a great sin, I'm afraid, for those who believe that you know, big books are a crime against humanity. This weighs in, this first volume, this is going to weigh in at roughly 1,400 pages. So that's why I kind of like flashing this thing, because it's people sort of think that this is it, you know, then I feel good. But yes, I'm afraid it's enormous, because it is a narrative. It does, in fact, try to do sex and sewer systems and politics and poetry and architecture and finance and crime and blah, 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 but to string them together and to show the intersections and the interconnections. So yeah, I'm afraid it's horribly big.
Drama as well as the facts and details here. Are you trying to combine those two, if I'm hearing what you just did?
That's the attempt.
Historical text.
Yeah, that's the attempt. What I did in the first part of this was to, in fact, extract from this and give you some of the framework, you know, the bones without flesh lying around on. But all that stuff is in there. It's just told rather than pointed at. So yes, it is a lunatic enterprise. Yes, sir.
Does the book contain visuals or illustrations?
Yes, there are 150 illustrations. As this thing goes around, you'll see a few of them. And there's also a reasonable, bare-bones map apparatus as well. It's not an illustrated history. It's a text-based history, but we have incorporated the illustrations into the text. So for those of you who are really well aware of the iconography of New York, like there's a very famous picture of the ruins of the Merchants Exchange. So we have that image, but rather than have them segregated in some little section, they come at this point in the text. So I'm hoping that, in fact, they carry something more of a wallop than they would if they were kind of separate. So yes, there's at least an attempt to have an illustrative apparatus. Yes, sir.
You're focusing on reading about the fire of 1835. Was this the point where the insurance companies pretty much ran the fire departments, or is it already a municipal function here in New York?
No, in fact, it is very shortly after this that the fire insurance companies, who, as you can imagine, were badly burned in this affair, in fact, are people who are amongst the most powerful forces pushing for the development of a water supply system. This is, of course, a vast story, which I suspect a lot of you know, that in fact we did not have a satisfactory water supply system. We were still relying on wells, even though they had long been polluted and were insufficient for this tremendously booming population, in part because Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton actually had saddled on us this kind of corrupt deal where, in essence, to get a charter for the Bank of the Manhattan Company, Burr cast it as being the establishment of a water supply system with a little banking on the side. Once he got the charter, in fact, it was the banking system that was up front and it was the water company that was on the side. And so, in fact, the city was not only vulnerable to fire, it was vulnerable to disease, it was vulnerable to dirt. These new manufacturing operations were in trouble because there was no water. So there was building up a tremendous head of steam to reach up and out to where we got it from eventually, the Croton Aqueduct system, and at the Croton River, and run an aqueduct down to the city. But the people who were really instrumental in blasting this through against the bank's opposition were the only people who were really powerful enough to do that, who were the insurance companies, who were themselves allied with many of the leading merchants in town. The insurance companies, in fact, seize hold of the water supply system, but they don't run the fire department. It's not until 1866 that when there is tremendous outrage by then built up at the old-fashioned, brawling, manly firemen who still, in the 1850s and the 1860s, were refusing to adopt new technology. It was only then that, again, led by the insurance companies, that a professional fire department was established and the volunteers were retired. So those are two key moments for the intervention of the fire insurance people. Yes, ma'am.
What started the limestone structures as well as the cast iron buildings? Was it the fire?
No, stone, in fact, goes back a bit. Stone is, in fact, a function. It's easy, you know. It's cheap. It's accessible. It gets more accessible as the steamboat technology comes online. So you can bring the stuff down from the Hudson or along the Connecticut shoreline. Brownstone comes in a little bit later, but it's really still the same thing. It just gets cheaper. Brownstone is, in fact, easier to work with than limestone. You can sculpt it, and by then they were into fancy, schmancy. So they liked brownstone, oddly enough, given the reputation that eventually developed because it was a classier material. Trinity, in fact, when it rebuilds itself in the 1840s, is one of the first to adopt the new stone. I mean, if you're going back far enough, it's brick that's key. I mean, the city in the 18th century burned down all the time because we're talking wood houses. So slowly what they did was they established fire limits, which crept up the city, and the limits said that south of this line, you had to build in brick. So it was brick that was key in terms of attempting to deal with fire. Yes, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
How long after independence did it take for trade to re-establish itself with England and its empire?
Well, in fact, things begin to get brisker in the 1790s because of the Napoleonic Wars. Both England and France, one of the virtues of being independent is that now you can trade with both sides. Not, to be frank, that we didn't, in fact, do a lot of that when we were part of the British Empire. When there was a war on with the French, and the British were attempting to blockade, say, Martinique or Haiti, French islands in the Caribbean, you could count on New York merchants using the swift, nifty ships turned out by the East River shipyards to dart past the Brits and trade with the enemy. But now, happily, we're neutral, so we can trade with both sides. We got away with that until, of course, it turned into the War of 1812. But during the 1790s, we had a decent run, but that was a direct supply of England. It wasn't, in fact, the Caribbean revival. Yes, sir.
With the massive amount of research that you did you find that you either exploded some conventional myths or discover anything that's going to be sort of new for historians?
Revolutionary slant. Well, first of all, I have to clear up one misconception. No, we did no research whatsoever. If we had really, well, that's a little exaggerated. If in fact we had done research in the sense that, like I used to do it when I was doing other projects, you actually went and pored over manuscripts, this would have taken, conservatively speaking, 350 years, you know, roughly the length of time that it covers. But what we have done is draw upon a spectacular efflorescence in research on New York City, but every aspect of it. There has been, in the last 20, 30 years, a incredibly rich treasure chest of work done by people who really are doing research, but it's on everything. It's on slavery, it's on artisanal life, it's on shipping, it's on telegraphy, it's on prostitution, it's on everything. So, in fact, what we've tried to do is to take the real labor that these real people have done. You know, they fastened all these jewels, and what we're doing is we're stringing together and making a nice necklace out of them. What the contribution here is the interconnections and the juxtapositions of these things, because perforce, most historians have to work in a particular track, you know, economic history or political history or whatnot. And by using this narrative form, we've tried, I mean, obviously, the really people who can do this the best are novelists, who, you know, are the geniuses at this. But, you know, we tried to sort of play with those interconnections. And I suspect there'll be a lot of surprises coming out of that. Also, I think, simply because so much of this new work has been locked up in monographs and doctoral dissertations and articles in obscure journals, much of it is, you know, reasonably written, but a lot of it, I have to confess, is written for other academics to read, and is, you know, it's barely literate. There are all kinds of revolutionary new work that is embedded in this, but we certainly can't claim credit for having unsmoked a gun somewhere, you know, that will really knock your socks off. But I think the cumulative story that emerges out of this is going to be a tremendous surprise. I mean, it depends on where you're coming from. I suspect most people here are already serious aficionados and such, but you know, when I teach, when I talk, many people are flabbergasted to find out that this was a slave society. That in the 1740s, 20% of the population were African slaves. So it depends on where you're coming from. For those who really aren't up on the tremendous amount of work done in black history in the last 20, 30 years, it's going to be seriously startling. Yes, sir?
Well, in light of the fact that, you know, you just mentioned how, like, the first part of this book, or the first volume, is these past, you know, I guess everything from 1898 and previous, and that seems like that would be the area in which it's harder to find documentation compared to, like, the recent century where it's been, you know, really a century of history.
Right.
Are you really, what's your plan for, is there going to be a second volume?
Oh, yes. Ted and I collaborated on this enterprise. He's now going to go off and get a life. And I'm going to go back to my monastery in Brooklyn and try not to drive my wife, Hope, who's here in the back, and New York City historian in her own right, try not to drive her mad, as I indeed deal with the problem of excess. But happily, because I don't do research, it's cut down somewhat. If I really had to do stuff from scratch, and now you've got to deal with at this end of the equation, phone logs and emails and whatnot. Just think of the Clinton, you know, investigation, the kinds of range of material that they're going to be plowing through. They're already in that 16 boxes of stuff. That's not my problem. But the same story holds actually a little less, interestingly, in the 20th century. There has been a tremendous amount of work that I'm going to be trying to stitch together. So it's, you know, it's pretty crazy.
Bringing together a lot of,
What's that?
you feel like you're sort of redacting a lot of it and bringing it all together and sort
That's what I'm trying to do. It's an old-fashioned kind of narrative synthesis. I mean, historians used to do this kind of stuff, but really since the Second War, perhaps, we've gotten so narrow and so specialized, and we've forgotten how to talk to, you know, real people, fellow citizens who are interested in the stories of their places. So this is an attempt to do storytelling, and it both tells hundreds and hundreds of stories. We just got the index back. It's got an astonishing number of individuals in the individual index, but it also attempts to sort of pull them together into a grand narrative. So it's a 19th century kind of thing to do in an era when people now read books, you know, this size. We're committing 2 gigantic tombstones. Yes?
Citing sources, or are you just working generically?
This is in fact this is a sore point in my. If I had my scholarly druthers, and we started off doing it this way, everything would be annotated. My ideal book, in fact, would be on a CD-ROM, so you wouldn't get a hernia carrying it home from the bookstore. But also, it would allow you to click on a particular sentence, ideally, and bang, you've got a transparent, you know, set of connections. We then drew back from that because the apparatus was enormous. It would have taken another book this same size. And then we took a crack at bibliographical essays, which we've still got. But even then, they're kind of more stripped down now. So every section of the book has got a corresponding section where we list, these are the people whom we turn to, both for grand conceptual notions and for the specific stories and details. But it is not footnoted down to the last punctilious thing. It was a trade-off. We decided that in the interests of being able to reach, you know, much larger numbers of people, we'd have to forego the full-scale academic apparatus. Yes, ma'am.
Name index. Is there a subject index?
Yes, there is a subject index too. So you can, one of the nice things that you see when you browse through that is that in fact there are these tracks running through it. So were this on CD or were this online, you could in fact, in essence, click on a sub-story. So there's a history of theater in New York. There's a history of Italians in New York. There's a history of prostitution in New York. Now they're all interwoven and connected, but the index allows you, if you're so inclined, to track those particular stories throughout the massive text. Yes, sir?
Were there any serious rivals to New York about being, you know, the #1 city?
Yes, certainly. In this period in which we speak, when we start this takeoff in the 1790s, Philadelphia is definitely #1, and Boston is still a serious contender. It is in this moment when, and the Erie Canal can't be overstressed, we had that break in the mountain chain. Philadelphia did not. And by capturing and establishing that trade route connection and then running with it and pulling all those spin-offs, it was that which allowed us to sort of keep going. Philadelphia still remained a very powerful player through the 1830s at least in finance, partly because, not to get into too much detail, although it's in here like everything else, but the Bank of the United States, which was an official, it wasn't the Federal Reserve, but it was sort of. The National Bank was in Philadelphia. And it had tremendous resources because the federal government deposited its funds there. This drove New Yorkers crazy because the overwhelming majority of the funds that kept the federal government, which was a lot smaller in those days, afloat, came from customs duties on goods coming into the Port of New York. So the money was collected here and then taken down to Philadelphia and used for banking purposes. There was a tremendous war in the 1830s, the Bank War it's called, which is, you know, itself a major story, which in essence New York wins. And the Bank of New York is crushed, and then the financial capital moves here, and then that's it, it's history. And Philadelphia specializes, it goes into putting its capital into mining, for instance, and it begins developing its hinterland. Massachusetts goes into manufacturing and developing the Lowell mills and such, but New York picks up the prizes and runs with it. And after that, there's nobody in sight. Have we exhausted you? There we go. Sorry?
From the historian's point of view, what happens if we lose the port as the economic engine?
You mean now?
Now.
Oh, well, now that's volume 2, so technically I shouldn't say anything about it. But, I mean, of course, depending on how you look at it, we've already lost the port. If you're talking about this side of the water, it's, of course, long since the 60s gone to Jersey. But in general, you know, one of the major transformations that has taken place over the 20th century, but remarkably, in a relatively short space of time, certainly since the Second War, is the relative decline of the port. I mean, whatever the port situation, the centrality of commerce has diminished dramatically. So, worst case scenario, were the port, in fact, to shut down altogether, I think it'd be horrible, but I don't think it would be the kind of blow that it would have been if it had suddenly happened 50 years ago. Because the nexus between commerce and manufacturing, for instance, is very close. Manufacturing is history, you know. Not completely. We should talk about the possibilities of reversing that. These trends aren't, I don't think, ineluctable. But, you know, commerce has been declining. I mean, early in this century, really, it was the last hurrah for the great merchants. In our period, the merchants were the kings of the city. I mean, no queens. They were the preeminent leaders. By the 1890s, 1900s, power had passed to the J.P. Morgans, the financiers, the people who were astride banking, which had been a little rib back in this period, but by then, in fact, had grown to awesome dimensions and far more central to the city's economy. If we're talking aughts, however, I would, in fact, be among those who would favor a massive resuscitation of the port. It's a tricky question as to whether it would fly or not. I'm extremely interested in this notion of building the Cross Harbor tunnel, which would allow connections to the mainland, which were always a problem for the port. And if that, in fact, came back, if the port were able to turn around and revive, then manufacturing, in fact, might, in fact, be. I'm extremely concerned, as are obviously many people in the city, that we have, in fact, by progressively shedding economic functions and retreating to this fairly narrow and extremely dicey core of finance and its associated real estate complex, which is, as of course you're seeing now once again, I mean, I should just say, one of the spines in both of these volumes that helps organize the narrative is the up and down of the business cycle. And we try to trace characteristic boom eras and then characteristic depression eras, which have been coming more or less like clockwork since now. I mean, in fact, the fire and its aftermath is a high moment. 1837 is the panic of 1837. And the economy is plunged into depression. There's massive unemployment. There are riots in the streets. There are demands for unemployment relief. And it is a depression which lasts for the next 7 to 8 years. You know, that kind of oscillation has been going on forever. But you could weather that more readily when you had a multivariate economy. Now, if in fact the stock market seriously crashes, if the Asian flu, in fact, arrives, and the Asian flu is nonsense, because, in fact, we have a great deal to do with the construction of that state of affairs in the first place. But if, in fact, it goes downhill, this place will shed broker load in nothing flat, and the spin-off from that in terms of condos and high-end restaurants and everything else will be drastic and shocking. And because you don't have the port in the way that you had it once, you're that much more vulnerable to this. Yes, sir?
Yes, you mentioned that after New York put Philadelphia and Boston in the dust, it sort of it shirked all its rivals. But didn't in the 1880s and 1890s, wasn't Chicago the wonder city of the age?
No question about it. And in fact, that is, I thank you, cue here for the last chapter, I hate to say it, 69, which in fact talks about the consolidation of New York. And one of the major reasons that the consolidation takes place, there are many in 1898, is that Chicago is exploding. Now understand, Chicago, which had been a little Fort Dearborn trading port, was in fact itself an artifact of the Erie Canal. That because the Great Lakes become the vehicle for transmitting the goods from the Midwest, Chicago leaps into tremendous prominence. And that continues with the shift to rails, with the westward expansion, so that the demographic center of the country moves ever closer to its doors. There's a lot of reasons for it. And it is gaining, and there's no question about it. And one of the things that the then financial and still mercantile leaders in New York say in the 1890s they were particularly burned after they lost the World's Fair. So that Chicago got the Columbian Exposition in 1894. This was taken as a harbinger of doom. So the answer merged with Brooklyn, which, let's remember, was an independent city, and at that point the third largest city in the United States. It was no slouch. Putting those two together allows it to maintain that lead, to vault ahead once again, and then you're on. So you're right, there's a second stage to this. I was thinking only in volume 1, early volume 1 context.
That should do it. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much. Hear, hear.
The authors of Gotham have been collaborating on the 1,200-page history book for 20 years. They're now working on a second volume.